We used to call gender transition sex reassignment surgery. We used to think of gender transition as the process of moving from one clearly identified gender to the other. Gender is much more complex than that. Some people are seeking to move from female to male, but many people see themselves as moving to an understanding of gender that is not clearly defined as either male or female.
What I'm typically referring to for binary would be people who identify as women or men. And those are the ways that in sociology and everyday life we've just been taught to think about all people are either women or men. And then you have this introduction of an entire new way of thinking about gender, and that's non-binary. So people who don't fit neatly into those categories of woman or man.
I had heard about a surgeon who was or is the top surgeon in the country. He does a version of mastectomies for mainly the transmasculine population. And I decided I was going to go down to his office and interview everyone who was having surgery on the same day. So I interviewed them during that surgery week over the course of several days. I also interviewed the individuals who accompanied them to the surgeon's office, parents, friends, significant others. And then over the course of the next year, I interviewed each of them on a regular basis.
And so then I started interviewing providers and going to healthcare conferences and observing them and how they teach each other about how to work with trans people. A lot of medical providers are trained to think about, how do I work with this person, right? To help heal them because they're unhealthy right now. And with trans people, usually at the moment that they enter the clinic, they already have a sense that they're trans. So medical providers, they're being asked to work with the patient population in a way that fundamentally is at odds with how they've been trained to think about working with patients. And most of the time, trans people are like, I just need you to help me get access to hormones or surgery.
One of my primary subjects is a person named Ben. Ben lives in suburban Maine. From a very early age, Ben felt that he wasn't really a girl. He was constantly encouraged to be feminine, to tone down his interest in roughhousing and sports, and he could never really conform to the gender that other people wanted him to be. It wasn't until he heard this term transgender and heard about the possibility of undergoing a gender transition that he even imagined that it was possible to present himself in the world as male. And the moment he heard about it, he knew that that was what he wanted. It was a huge struggle, though. He was very, very close to his family. A huge struggle for him to convince his parents in particular that this was something that would improve his life. And finally, they came along. And actually, they were with him that day at the surgeon's office, and I met them.
Doctors are still approaching their patients in a very stepwise fashion. Step 1, make sure they've seen a therapist. Step 2, therapist writes a letter recommending, and then a provider will say, okay, now you've been legitimated. And that is where a lot of tension comes in those interactions between providers and trans people, is to slow it down. Let's put some steps in here to ensure that you're really ready. And how trans people think about readiness and what that might mean and how providers do is also, I think it's fundamentally at odds with each other. Because for a medical provider, what they want to hear is, I am ready to do this, and I'm in it, and I'm for the rest of my life. And they're expecting that step 1, step 2, step 3, and then galloping into the distance, happily transitioned.
Ben now presents himself in the world as a man in public. As he describes it, he feels much more comfortable. He feels happier. He feels less of a sense of distress. It hasn't solved all of his problems. He still has to navigate the world. He still has to explain his choices to different people. He has to, sort of engage the medical establishment in order to get the hormones that he needs and, in order to maintain this transition over time. But if you ask him and you ask most other people who have undergone gender transitions, they would say that their lives have been improved immeasurably. Which isn't to say that they've, that it's not uncomplicated.
Sometimes for trans people, it's like, I want to try this and I don't know. But I think where it gets troubling is that in healthcare, there's a power structure. So trans people have agency and can be empowered to say, you're not the right provider for me. But there's still the medical authority piece where doctors can still say, I don't think that you're ready, or I'm not going to do this. And it's that moment like that really sets the stage for a lot of different problems within healthcare for trans people. The burden comes in having to offer the script that they anticipate medical providers want to hear. So it helps us understand why between 1950 and 1970, most medical providers, when they were interacting with trans people, kept hearing the same narrative over and over and over. What they didn't understand is that trans people were coaching each other on, if you want to get hormones, this is what you have to say. And so medical providers were like, it's incredible. We have this whole population of people who all understand themselves in the same way. And some of the consequences are medical providers now expect that narrative, that normative narrative of how to talk about oneself as trans. Providers expect that.
But people have varying ways of understanding and explaining their motivations. Some people explain it in very internalized psychological terms. I'm changing my body to reflect how I feel internally. There are other people who draw upon gender theory, transgender ideology, transgender politics, about the importance of challenging the binary gender system. Not everybody uses the same kinds of vocabularies, the same kinds of, conceptualizations to understand who they are, explain who they are to others.
And yet a lot of trans people know that when they go to the clinic, they have to more or less kind of conform to that script of, ever since I was a young child, I always knew I was in the wrong body. I wanted to play with my fill-in-the-blank other siblings' toys and wear their clothes, and because that's what medical providers have now come to anticipate and expect. And if you don't offer that narrative, you might not actually get access to hormones.
There's some people who have suffered a great deal because they've been assigned to a gender that they don't feel reflects who they really are. One of the ways to alleviate suffering is by making our understandings of gender more complex, suggesting that the categories that we use to define people could be, more flexible, more malleable, and more expansive.